Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture for Core 201. Today, we are going to talk about the pamphlet Common Sense. And this is one of my favorite pieces that we're going to read all semester, because it's basically an epic breakup letter with Britain. I think you're going to like this one. It's written in very simple language, it has a lot of very simple ideas, and I think you're especially going to like Thomas Paine. So, as we always do, let's talk about the author. So here he is, Thomas Paine. And the thing that I think you're really going to like about him is that he's not wealthy, and he's not well-educated. He's basically a self-made man, and that sets him apart from a lot of the other authors that we're reading this semester. I know you guys complain all the time that it's a bunch of old white guys, and he is white, and he did get old, but he's not wealthy. So basically, Thomas Paine was kind of like a working class. His father was a corset maker, and he actually apprenticed as a corset maker himself. But he was much more interested in philosophy and politics, and basically he wanted to move in those circles. So he started participating in the politics in his local town, he started getting in a little bit of trouble, and so in 1774 he moved to America at the recommendation of Benjamin Franklin, and actually with a letter of recommendation from Benjamin Franklin, which is pretty cool. So here's a brief timeline of essentially what he did. 1774, moved to America. And as you might notice, this was kind of a crucial time in American history. There was a lot going on. So he was just in time for the American Revolution, in which he played a big part. Then he was kind of into revolution. He thought he might just keep going. So in 1792, he moved to France. In France, he helped with their revolution, because, you know, he was already on board. Then he started getting in a bunch of political trouble. Eventually he made his way back to England. Eventually he made his way back to America. And he lived out the rest of his days in America. And he died on his farm in New York, and people have been trading his bones back and forth ever since. That part's kind of weird. So, his major contributions are mostly political, but they're also kind of stylistic. The thing that really sets him apart, especially from all of the other people who were writing at the time, was the way that he phrased things in plain language. He wrote for the average American citizen. Basically, he wanted his pamphlet to be read by everybody, and that's why it's so much fun to read out loud. I hope that you read it out loud, like I said, but it's one of those things that is best yelled, it's best read in company, it's best meant in its emphatic voice. So one of his major contributions, really, was writing in plain language and writing things that just made sense. He belonged to a school of philosophy that basically believed that the average person can make solid political decisions. And again, this was kind of a new thought, right? We used to believe that the king made great decisions and the peasants did peasant things. But he belonged to a school of thought that said that basically all intelligent people can make intelligent decisions. That the average person is perfectly capable of making a sound decision. And that's one of the things that really set Thomas Paine apart. We are going to focus on one really specific thing that Thomas Paine wrote, but he had a pretty varied literary career. He wrote all sorts of stuff, especially later in his life. And he was pretty liberal, I guess we would say now. He was a deist, and he was a huge believer in religious freedom. He believed in the rights of workers. He was really anti-slavery. He had a lot of beliefs about the common man and their place in society. So, as you can imagine, this was unpopular, especially among people who were wealthy and educated. So in a lot of the political cartoons at the time, you'll see them referencing his past as a corset maker, because essentially they were trying to reference the fact that he used to have a job. That might sound familiar. This is something we still make fun of politicians for. So one thing that's really interesting about Thomas Paine was that he essentially rose through the ranks. He was a self-made man who wrote one of the most famous pamphlets of all time, and he was very liberal in his beliefs for the time. So if you have time to read some more of Thomas Paine's work, I think you might like some of his other pieces too. So today, we're focusing on his pamphlet, Common Sense, which is a great title. And this is proportionally the best-selling book in American history. It sold 500,000 copies in its first year, which is especially impressive considering there were about 2 million Americans, so almost 1 in 5 people had a copy of this. And Americans were pretty literate at this point in time, so it's not a huge surprise that they were all reading, but it is a huge surprise that they were all reading basically the same thing. It was definitely a must-read for any political rebel. So basically, it was short, it was sensible, it was written in language that everybody could understand, and it contained a lot of things that Americans wanted to talk about, specifically whether we should break up with Britain. And one reason that we keep reading this piece after all of these years is because it had such an impact. So John Adams said, "Without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain." That's how powerful this book is. We might not have ever gone to war at all if he hadn't written this. So again, the reason that we read these old pieces is because they have lasting consequences, and this one is a great example. So, as always, we didn't read the whole thing, even though it is pretty short, but I wanted to tell you about the parts that we didn't read. Basically, he has a couple of fundamental ideas. Here they are. Number one, monarchy is subject to tyranny. Basically, anytime you put that much control in the hands of one person, you run the risk of them becoming a tyrant. Number two, secession is fallible, especially hereditary secession. So this means that having the next king be the son of the last king leads to a lot of problems, and again, we've seen this. Third, electing leaders will actually protect the interest of the governed, because they will elect people who protect their interests. So essentially where he's going with this is that monarchy is bad, we've seen it fail, instead we should elect people. This quote, I think, sums it up quite nicely, although it is kind of a chunk of a quote. "To the evil of monarchy, we have added that of hereditary succession. And as the first is a degradation and lessening of ourselves, so the second, claimed as a matter of right, is an insult and an imposition on posterity. For all men being originally equals, no one, by birth, could have a right to set up his own family in perpetual preference to all others forever." So some of this we've heard before, this idea that monarchy is subject to tyranny, that secession may not be the way to do it, but this focus on equality is one of the things that's new. This is one of those sort of like Enlightenment ideals that we hadn't seen before. So for Paine, basically, he's trying to set up this argument that we deserve to elect our leaders, and we deserve to have a system of government that protects our interests and those of our children, and their children, and their children, posterity. So for the first part of the pamphlet, basically he's setting up his premise, which is monarchy is bad, democracy is good. The other thing I wanted to talk about before we really dig into the pamphlet is what was going on in America at the time. And the answer is a lot. So basically, Americans were making a lot of money. Things were kind of going well. We had a lot of crops, we had a lot of manufacturing, and the thing is that they didn't want to send that money back to England. They were making all of these profits, and they were getting taxed really, really heavily. And they were like, wait a second, this is stupid. We want to keep our money, and if we are going to pay taxes, we want a say in where those taxes go and what they do. So this is where the phrase, no taxation without representation, comes from. Basically the idea that if we're going to pay taxes, we want a seat at the table. So since Americans were actually doing kind of great economically, they were really interested in dividing themselves from Britain so that they could keep all their money. So basically, here's a few key historic events, just in case it's been a minute since you had American history. In 1765, the Stamp Act, and this one was about taxation. In 1767, the Townshend Act, and this one was about assemblies. Basically, they didn't want people to assemble together because they were afraid they would revolt. This should sound familiar, right? We heard about this way back with Aristotle, and this continues to be a thing that we find very important. We put it right there in the First Amendment. In 1770, things started to get physical. So that's when the Boston Massacre happened, which was kind of the tipping point for the whole thing. That's when people really started shooting each other. In 1773, the Boston Tea Party. A lot of things happened in Boston at this point in history. In 1774, people started coming together to think about a new government, to think about maybe setting up their own democracy. That was the First Continental Congress. In 1775, we started to have actual battles. That's when the battles of Lexington and Concord happened. And then finally, in 1775, we had the Battle of Bunker Hill, and that one was kind of a moral victory for the American troops. So basically, things had been building up. Tensions had been escalating, taxation had been escalating. We had gotten to the point where we were fighting actual battles with American militias against British troops. So at the point in history where he's writing this, everybody's pretty tense, and everybody's pretty angry, and we're right on the brink of war. So the point of this pamphlet is basically to give us that push and send us to war. Did it work? You should probably know that part. Yes, it did. So the section that we're focusing on is called Thoughts of the Present State of American Affairs, which is a pretty good title. And the best part is that he opens with this very beautiful sentence. In the following pages, I offer nothing more than simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense. Isn't that great? I feel like that's the only thing we really want. I feel like that's the only thing we still want. I wish all politicians came forward with simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense. It's a great way to open, sets the stage, and really gives us something that we want. It's something the Americans back then wanted. It's something I would argue the Americans right now want. So this is a great opening sentence. So at the start of this section, he starts to address this question of whether we should break up with Britain at all. After all, it was a really big decision. It was a big choice. It was going to change the course of history. So he starts to acknowledge these arguments that people are making that say maybe we shouldn't. So he starts with this. Should we just wait for this to blow over? Like, sure, we're fighting with Britain right now, but maybe we should just wait it out. Maybe it'll get better. But he says, no. The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. 'Tis not the affair of a city, a country, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent. 'Tis not the concern of a day, a year, or an age. Posterity are virtually involved in the contest, and will be more or less affected even to the end of time by the proceedings now. Now is the seed time of continental union, faith, and honor. So the whole thing is written in this kind of like bombastic language, but I love it so much. And this is a really interesting argument. Basically, he's saying, we can't wait for this to blow over. This is a really big deal. This is a big deal for the whole continent. This is a big deal for our posterity, which turned out to be true, right? Like, that's us. And so his whole argument here is we can't wait for this to blow over. We need to deal with it right now. So the second question is basically, well, maybe we should reconcile with Britain. Like, maybe it's bad right now, but she's going to get her act together. Maybe we should just make up. And again, he says, no. As much has been said of the advantages of reconciliation, basically he's saying, yeah, we've heard your arguments about why we should reconcile. It is but right that we should examine the contrary side of the argument and inquire into some of the many material injuries which these colonies sustain and will always sustain by being connected with and dependent on Great Britain. So again, he's saying, like, yeah, I heard you. You had all these arguments for reconciliation, but now you need to hear me. I have all these arguments for breaking up. Then he argues, you know what? We don't even need Britain. We thought we did, but we don't. America would have flourished as much and probably much more had no European power had anything to do with her. The commerce by which she hath enriched herself are the necessaries of life, and will always have a market while eating is the custom in Europe. So this part gets really sassy, but basically his argument is America would have been successful even if all of the colonists had come from somewhere else. Like, sure, a bunch of them came from Britain, but they could have come from anywhere else in the world, and the American colonies would still have been successful. In part because America was pretty fertile, especially the southeastern part, and so we were growing lots and lots of crops, and we were sending lots and lots of things back to England. And so his argument is, as long as eating is the custom, which is basically this argument that as long as people want to eat, we have things to sell them. So he's getting pretty sassy, but the argument is basically, we're going to be fine because people want what we're selling. We don't need Britain, we just need to sell things. So then he enters into an emotional argument. And this argument is basically, shouldn't we stay with Britain because she loves us and she supports us? And once again, he says, no. Alas, we have long been led away by ancient prejudices and made large sacrifices to superstition. We have boasted the protection of Great Britain without considering that her motive was interest, not attachment. That she did not protect us from our enemies on our account, but from her enemies on her account, from those who had no quarrel with us on any other account. And the italics here are his, again, very dramatic. But his argument is, no, the only reason that Britain protects us is because it's in her interest. She doesn't care what happens to us. She's not looking out for our best needs. She's looking out for her needs. And that's why we need to cut ties. Next, he starts addressing this idea that maybe we don't need to take on Britain's problems. Maybe Britain's problems are her own problems. Let Britain waive her pretensions to the continent, or the continent throw off the dependence, and we should be at peace with France and Spain, were they at war with Britain. Basically, we don't need to be fighting with everybody Britain's fighting with. We can just be chill. We can be like the noble capybara, just be friends with everybody. We don't have to take on Britain's fights. We can just let her be her own kind of messy little bitch. Then he argues, you know what, like, we're not even exclusive with Britain. We came from all over the place. We like people from all over the place. Maybe we don't want to be with only Britain anymore. Europe, and not England, is the parent country of America. This new world hath been the asylum for the persecuted lovers of civil and religious liberty from every part of Europe. So this is an ages-old argument. America is and has always been a nation of immigrants. So we identify with Britain. A lot of people came from Britain, but his argument here is, yeah, but they came from everywhere else too. All of these immigrants came from all different parts. So maybe we're not as exclusively British as we want to pretend that we are. He says, it is pleasant to observe by what regular gradations we surmount the force of local prejudice, as we enlarge our acquaintance with the world. And basically what he means here is that it's kind of cool to watch the melting pot in action. All of these immigrants from all different parts are living together, they're sharing their traditions, they're kind of melding into one, like, American identity. And maybe, he says, that's good. Maybe that's our strength. Maybe instead of identifying solely with Britain, we should acknowledge that we're kind of made up of everybody. So next, he acknowledges that if we did remain allied with Britain, we would be kind of a global superpower. We could take over all sorts of things all over the world. But he's like, maybe that's not what we want. Maybe that's not what we're in this for. Much has been said of the united strength of Britain and the colonies, that in conjunction, they might bid defiance to the world. But this is mere presumption. The fate of war is uncertain. So basically, yeah, with our forces combined, we would be something to reckon with. But that's not something we want to count on. Nobody ever knows what the outcome of war is going to be. So we don't want to necessarily tie ourselves with Britain with a plan of becoming a great big world power, because that's not really our primary interest. Instead, our primary interest is money. This is one of our primary American interests, to be sure. It remains one of our primary interests. So this is what he says. Besides, what have we to do with setting the world at defiance? Our plan is commerce. And that, well attended to, will secure us the peace and friendship of all Europe, because it is in the interest of all Europe to have America a free port. So he's basically saying, like, look, we're not in this for world domination. We're in this to get that bread. And so if we want to continue to get that bread, to make as much money as possible, it would actually be better for us to be a free port. It would be better for us to not have a specific alliance and instead to trade with everybody from all over the place. And this is true. This is a good plan for commerce. So essentially, we're not interested in world domination. We're interested in money. So next, he does kind of a cost-benefit analysis. He's basically like, there are some benefits to staying with Britain, but there are some benefits to leaving. I challenge the warmest advocate for reconciliation to show a single advantage this continent can reap by being connected with Great Britain. There were advantages, but again, he's being dramatic. But the injuries and disadvantages we sustain by that connection are without number. And our duty to mankind at large, as well as to ourselves, instruct us to renounce the alliance. So again, he's leaning heavily on this argument that staying with Britain is bad for us. In part, he argues it's bad for us because Britain is kind of messy. Britain has a lot of drama. She goes to war with everybody all the time, she's putting up new colonies all the time, naval battles. So basically he's like, maybe we should just step back. Europe is too thickly planted with kingdoms to be long at peace, and whenever a war breaks out between England and any foreign power, the trade of America goes to ruin because of her connection with Britain. The next war may not turn out like the last, and should it not, the advocates for reconciliation now will be wishing for separation then. So again, essentially he's saying Britain is just constantly fighting with everybody. And when she fights with everybody, we get dragged into fighting with everybody. And maybe we should just not. And to be fair, he's right about Europe being really thickly planted with kingdoms. This is a map of what was going on in Europe at the time. And you'll notice that parts of it look familiar, Spain, France, but this middle part has changed dramatically since then. So basically the Holy Roman Empire had split up into several different colonies. And then over here you can see that the Ottoman Empire is still in power. And so if you've ever wondered why everyone in fairy tales is a princess, it's because there were so many kingdoms. There were just lots of princesses to go around. So with all of these different people to fight with, Britain was often at war. So his argument is, maybe instead of going to war every 5 minutes, we should just break up with Britain. So now he starts to really get dramatic. So he starts with this argument about God and how God wants us to be America. The time, likewise, at which the continent was discovered adds weight to the argument, and the manner in which it was peopled increases the force of it. The Reformation was preceded by the discovery of America, as if the Almighty graciously meant to open a sanctuary to the persecuted in future years, when home should not afford neither friendship nor safety. So, yeah, we're just completely blowing past all the people who are already here, America. But his argument is that we discovered America right in time for the Puritans to come here. So essentially, we discovered this land just in time for the religiously persecuted people to have a safe place to go. This is a weak argument. The next one's kind of good. The next one, he's sort of throwing shade at anybody who might believe that he's wrong. He's talking about who even wants to reconcile with Britain, and he starts to really throw some insults at them. Interested men who are not to be trusted, weak men who cannot see, prejudiced men who will not see, and a certain set of moderate men who think better of the European world than it deserves. So basically, he's like, you know who is in favor of reconciliation? Morons. And prejudiced people. And people who just like Europe a lot, but they're wrong. So now, instead of just making good arguments about why we should break up with Britain, he's kind of making a straw man argument that the people who don't want to break up with Britain are dumb. So he's kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks at this point, but, he's got to try some things. The next argument gets real serious. So in this one, he's kind of flipping the script, and he's basically saying, if you want to reconcile, maybe it's because you didn't live through it, and maybe it's because you're a bad person. So this is a bit of a wall of text, but buckle up. But if you say you can still pass the violations over, then I ask, hath your house been burnt? Hath your property been destroyed before your face? Are your wife and children destitute of a bed to lie on or bread to live on? Have you lost a parent or child by their hands, and yourself ruined and wretched survivor? If you have not, then you are not a judge of those who have. But if you have, and can still shake hands with the murderers, then you are unworthy of the name of husband, father, friend, or lover, and whatever your rank or title in life, you have the heart of a coward and the spirit of a sycophant. Harsh. Really harsh. Really mean. The heart of a coward and the spirit of a sycophant. So basically he's saying, look, either you were impacted by this, they burnt down your house, they killed your son, they really ruined your life, or you weren't impacted by this, but you're blind to the suffering of others, and you suck. So this is one of the parts that was really popular for reading out loud, because I'm sure you can imagine it was a great way to sort of indirectly throw shade at other people in the room who might think that we should reconcile. You would read this part loudly and in a spirited manner, and it was powerful. So now it's time to rile up the troops. It's time to use a lot of really strong language and get people ready to go. So he says, every quiet method for peace hath been ineffectual. Our prayers have been rejected with disdain, and only tended to convince us that nothing flatters vanity or confirms obstinacy in kings more than repeated petitioning. So basically he's saying, yeah, nothing we've tried yet has worked. We pray and nothing happens. We petition the king and nothing happens. In fact, it might be that the king likes to be petitioned because it puts him in a position of power and he likes turning us down. So basically he's saying, no more thoughts and prayers, only action. So, this next sentence is so bombastic that I love it so much. Wherefore, since nothing but blows will do, for God's sake, let us come to a final separation, and not leave the next generation to be cutting throats under the violated, unmeaning names of parent and child. So seriously, he's ready to go. He's like, look, we need to deal with this. We cannot leave this to our children. We cannot keep pretending that Britain is our mother and we are the child. The time for action is now. And again, this worked. We went to war like 5 minutes later. So now that everybody's all riled up, he makes a few pretty solid logical points. The first one, I think, pretty bold. As to government matters, it is not in the power of Britain to do this continent justice. The business of it will soon be too weighty and intricate to be managed with any tolerable degree of convenience by a power so distant from us, and so very ignorant of us. For if they cannot conquer us, they cannot govern us. So he's ready now. He's basically like, look, they don't even understand us. They don't even know us. And frankly, if they can't conquer us, they can't tell us what to do. So he's ready now. Come at me, bro. His next two arguments are also really logical. First, he argues that this is just an inefficient way to run a country. Britain is like all the way over there, and they're slow. To be always running 3,000 or 4,000 miles with a Taylor petition, waiting 4 or 5 months for an answer, which when obtained requires 5 or 6 more to explain it in, will in a few years be looked at as folly and childishness. There was a time when it was proper, and there is a proper time for it to cease. So basically, going back and forth across the ocean, especially the way that they had to do it back then, took forever. And you had to go all the way across the ocean, get an audience with the king, get an answer, talk to everybody about the answer, come all the way back to America, talk to everybody about the answer. And it took 5 or 6 months. Sometimes it took a year to really get anything done because you had to go all the way there and come all the way back. And so as we advance, especially as we advance technologically, we get rid of the old ways because they're dumb and slow. I don't know the last time any of you had to use a fax machine, but if you did, you probably noticed it was slow. When it was invented, it was the height of technology. You were able to send 18 pages an hour, and that was, whoa, it was a big deal. But now, that's dumb, and we don't want to do it anymore. So his argument that essentially there was a time when it was proper, and there's a proper time for it to cease, is very logical. The second argument is slightly less logical, but kind of mean. And he says, small islands not capable of protecting themselves are the proper object for kingdoms to take under their care. But there is something very absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. So his argument here is essentially maybe some colonies need your help, maybe little islands that can't protect themselves need your help, but this is America. It's a continent. It's gigantic. And we don't need the help of some tiny little island that's all the way across the ocean. Again, this is best read as dramatically as possible. So now he wants to enter into some arguments about how not fighting right now would actually be bad for us. Basically, he's arguing that putting this off is going to be negative. So, first, the powers of governing still remaining in the hands of the king, he will have a negative over the whole legislation of the continent. And as he has shown himself to be such an inveterate enemy to liberty, and discovered such a thirst for arbitrary power, is he or is he not a proper man to say to these colonies, you shall make no laws but what I please? So basically, he's saying if we continue to leave governing in the hands of the king, he's going to make bad decisions. Because he's already shown himself to be an enemy to liberty. He's already shown himself to have a thirst for arbitrary power. And basically, if we let him make all the rules, he's going to stomp over our good rules. So he goes a little bit more detail when he says, "We are already greater than the king wishes us to be. And will he not hereafter endeavor to make us less?" This part really does sound like a breakup letter. It's basically like, look, the king is already threatened by how smart and how amazing we are. All he does is try to squish us and make us smaller and put our little light under a bushel. If we continue to give him this power, he's not going to do anything but try to make us smaller. He's only ever going to try to make us less. He then says, "He may accomplish by craft and subtlety in the long run what he cannot do by force and violence in the short one." Again, totally an abusive partner. Basically, his argument is, even if he can't force us into submission with violence, with war, he's gonna kind of sneakily force us into submission. He's gonna use craft and subtlety. He's gonna use whispers and lies, laws, and just really sort of undercover things to get us to do what he wants us to do. So either way, we cannot trust this king. He only wants bad things for us. And if we don't cut him off now, he's just going to keep abusing us until he can't abuse us anymore. The second argument is that if we don't get this taken care of now and build a good government for ourselves now, everything's going to fall apart. We can't just keep putting duct tape on a hole in the road. That even the best of terms, which we can expect to obtain, can amount to no more than a temporary expedient, or a kind of government guardianship, which can last no longer than till the colonies come of age. So the general face and state of things in the interim will be unsettled and unpromising. Basically, any agreement that we come to in the meantime, besides full independence, is just going to be a kind of stopgap. It's just going to be a temporary fix. And a temporary fix is not what we want. That will not make us strong. And also, it will not make us attractive to other immigrants. Nobody who could choose to go to a full, safe, wealthy country is going to come here. Immigrants of property will not choose to come to a country whose form of government hangs but by a thread. So basically, if we want to make ourselves attractive to future immigrants, especially wealthy immigrants with property, then we need to put together a government that works. We can't have just some sort of cobbled together thing that's hanging together by a thread. We need to have a good government, a solid government, for those immigrants to come here and join. His third argument is that if we don't come together now and form one cohesive government, one cohesive country, we might end up just all splitting up into separate kingdoms. We might end up with a bunch of civil wars between the states. So essentially, we need to come together and make one solid government while we still can. But the most powerful of all arguments is that nothing but independence, a continental form of government, can keep the peace of the continent and preserve it inviolate from civil wars. We need one comprehensive continental form of government. He kind of draws on that argument a little bit more further on. A government which cannot preserve the peace is no government at all. And in that case, we pay our money for nothing. And pray, what is it that Britain can do, whose power will be wholly on paper, should a civil tumult break out the very day after reconciliation? So essentially, if we have this peace with Britain, it's still only on paper, and why should anyone believe in it? What's to stop the colonies from fighting each other any day of the week? And his argument is, if we don't have a strong central continental government, we're just going to break apart into pieces. We're just going to fight each other all day. So this is kind of the final part of that argument. Basically, we have to bring the colonies together because we have to make them equal and peaceful amongst each other. The colonies have manifested such a spirit of good order and obedience to continental government as is sufficient to make every reasonable person easy and happy on that head. Where there are no distinctions, there can be no superiority. Perfect equality affords no temptation. So essentially, the colonies are already doing a great job getting along. They're already free and equal. This is already going pretty well. Everybody seems pleased. Why not just cement it? why not just form one government that lets this happen? When all of the colonies are equal, all of the colonies will be peaceful. And that's why we need one government, and it needs to be American. So, now that Paine has argued that we need one central unified government, he has a few ideas. We kept some of these ideas. Some of them were pretty great, some of them were a little weird. Let's go through them. So first, a Continental Congress. And again, we already had tried this one time. We thought it went pretty well, so here's what he thinks. Let the assemblies be annual, with a president only, their representation more equal, their business wholly domestic, and subject to the authority of a Continental Congress. So basically he says getting together, different people from all of the colonies every year is going well. Let's keep doing it. But who should we send, you ask? He has an idea about delegates. Let each colony be divided into 6, 8, or 10 convenient districts. Each district to send a proper number of delegates to the Congress, so that each colony sends at least 30. So this is a pretty good idea, and essentially we did keep this idea that we would divide up the districts, usually by population, and each district would get their own representative. So the way that he has it figured we didn't quite keep with, but it's still not terrible. The next one is weird. So the next one we did not keep. His idea for how we should choose a president was basically that we should choose a new one every year. And also, we should take turns. When the delegates are met, let a colony be taken from the whole 13 colonies by lot, after which let the whole Congress choose, by ballot, a president from the delegates of that province. So essentially, it's one colony's turn. They bring a few of their representatives who become like the delegates that you can choose from, and then next year it's another colony's turn, and next year another colony's turn. So essentially every year, one state, for instance, would bring however many people they think are eligible, probably, hopefully not that many. You would choose one, and then the next year is another place's turn. This is kind of an interesting idea. I don't know. I don't hate it. I mean, having a new candidate every year I think could get kind of exhausting, but I like where he's going with this in regard to each state getting a chance at representation. So now that we have a loose idea of how we want things to look, we know how we want to get a president, we know how we want to make laws, he wants to get a bunch of people together to write it down. So essentially he thinks we should have a Continental Conference, at which point we write down a charter. So here's his idea for the conference. The members of Congress, assemblies or conventions, by having had experience in national concerns, will be able and useful counselors. And the whole, being empowered by the people, will have a truly legal authority. So this gets a little complicated. This is essentially what he has in mind here. There will be a committee that's made up of some of the members of Congress, 2 from each colony. There will also be representatives from the smaller provincial counties. So essentially he'll have 2 from each little province. There will also be just 5 citizens, elected, kind of chosen randomly at large from different cities. And the idea here is that they will have a combined knowledge that will create laws that will make sense. So we'll have people who are used to making laws, and we'll have people who are used to being under the law, so that they'll bring some information about how the law will work in reality. This is kind of a good idea, I think. We sort of do this idea that we have, 2 senators and as many representatives as you get, but this idea that there's just 5 random citizens is kind of interesting. So, once they get there, they're going to write a Continental Charter. Securing freedom and property to all men, and above all things, the free exercise of religion, according to the dictates of conscience, with other such matters as is necessary for a charter to contain. They're all going to get together at this conference, and they're going to write this document, which is kind of a response to the Magna Carta. And the idea behind the document is that they will write down, set in stone, all of the things that will dictate how the government works. And one thing he said that I thought was interesting was that they need to always remember that our strength is continental, not provincial. So even though there will be delegates from every different province, the whole will be the important thing. Writing a whole document for the whole continent is the most important part. So these ideas weren't bad. We kept some, we got rid of some, but on the whole, Thomas Paine was a pretty forward thinker. And so now we get into his final thoughts. And the first one is my favorite. It's the saltiest thing he's written yet, and I just love it so much. So, he's answering this question of, well, why not have a king? It's worked so far for everybody else, maybe we should have one. And he's like, oh, Do you want a coronation ceremony? I'll give you a coronation ceremony. So he says, let a day be solemnly set apart for proclaiming the charter. Let it be brought forth, placed on the divine law, the word of God. Let a crown be placed thereon, by which the world may know that so far as we approve of monarchy, that in America the law is king. I love this part. Basically, he's like, oh yeah, we'll crown a king, we'll crown our charter, we'll crown our constitution. If a coronation is what you want, we'll carry this little charter up, we'll put it on top of a Bible, we'll put a little crown on it, and we will worship it as king. But it's not a king, is it? It's a law. It's a series of laws. Fair laws, just laws. Laws that apply to everybody. And this is, I think, one of the greatest things that he writes, and one of really the best things about the American government that they came up with right after this. There's not a king, the law is king. So good. His final argument is that now is the time to write a constitution. Now is the time to set up the kind of government that we want to see, the kind of country that we want to see. A government of our own is our natural right. And when a man seriously reflects on the precariousness of human affairs, he will become convinced that it is infinitely wiser and safer to form a constitution of our own in a cool, deliberate manner, while we have it in our power, than to trust such an interesting event to time and chance. So essentially his argument is that we need to do this right now. We need to do it while we have time to be calm, to be cool and deliberate. We need to do it before the whole nation is on fire, before the whole war really kicks off. We need to do this. It's our natural right, and we need to do it right now. Okay, this final part is so dramatic, and I love it so much, and I want you to read it out loud at home at a yell. It's way better. I'm not going to yell for the video, but here we go. O ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only the tyranny but the tyrant, stand forth. Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom hath been hunted round the globe. Oh, receive the fugitive and prepare in time an asylum for mankind. So good, so dramatic. But this is amazing. This is his vision for America, that it would be an asylum for mankind, that it would be a safe place for immigrants to come. It would be safe for religious freedom. It would be safe for personal freedom. That basically everywhere else in the world is kind of dangerous right now, kind of overrun with oppression. So we should make our own country, our own continent, where everything is more peaceful, where we respect people's liberties, where we don't have any tyranny, that we should form an asylum for mankind. I just love it so much. So I'm really looking forward to talking with you about Thomas Paine, and I hope that you liked it and found it at least as pleasant as I found it. And I'll see you soon.